My name is Sophia Turner, and I have learned that a woman's silence is often mistaken for surrender. For months, I played the part of the quiet, grieving wife while my husband, Thomas, flaunted his betrayal in front of the world. He didn't bother to hide it. Why should he? He was wealthy, respected, adored by the same society that watched me wilt under his cruelty. He thought my silence meant defeat. He thought I would swallow the humiliation forever. He thought wrong. Thomas has always cared more about appearances than reality. The grand mansion, the flawless dinner parties, the carefully polished image of a man who built his empire from nothing. In truth, I had always been the one smoothing the edges, covering the cracks, making sure no one saw the rot beneath the marble. And yet, when his midlife ego demanded a younger woman, he paraded her on his arm like a prize, daring anyone to question him. Her name is Vanessa Cole, 26, ambitious, beautiful in the kind of obvious way that photographs well, under expensive chandeliers. She clung to Thomas as if he were both her savior and her stage. When she appeared beside him at charity galas, smiling like she already wore my crown, the whispers began. At first I heard pity. Poor Sophia, how humiliating. Then curiosity. How long will she endure? And finally, amusement. Perhaps she deserves it for clinging to a man like Thomas. But Thomas wasn't satisfied with public humiliation. He wanted me broken. Last week, he entered the sunlit breakfast room as if he were announcing a promotion and said, "Sophia, I'm hosting a dinner for Hale and the others this weekend, a proper gathering. Vanessa will be there, of course. I want you to handle the arrangements. You're so good at these things." The words cut deeper than a blade. He wanted me to plan the celebration of his infidelity. He wanted me to decorate the altar at which I was to be sacrificed. He looked at me with that familiar smugness, the gleam in his eye that dared me to refuse. I smiled. I said, "Of course, Thomas. Leave it to me." In that moment, something inside me shifted. My humiliation hardened into something sharper, cleaner. For months I had endured. Now endurance would become strategy. If he wanted a stage, I would give him one. If he wanted a performance, I would deliver a masterpiece. But this time, the spotlight would burn him alive. For the next few days, I moved like a ghost through the mansion. Staff came and went. Menus were discussed. Wine selected, silver polished until it gleamed like a blade. To anyone watching, I was the same efficient hostess I had always been. Inside, I was weaving threads of ruin, one quiet knot at a time. Thomas underestimated me. He always had. He saw me as ornamental, a wife to smile for photographs, to ensure the curtains matched the flowers, to stand gracefully at his side while he played king. What he never realized was that I had been watching him all these years. Every careless email he left open, every whispered conversation half finished when I entered the room, every discrepancy in the numbers he thought I wouldn't understand. I remembered. I catalogued. I prepared. The night of the dinner drew closer. A storm brewed on the horizon, the kind of relentless nor'easter that sweeps through Greenwich in September, trapping guests in gilded prisons. I watched the weather forecast with a calm smile. There could be no better stage. An opulent dining hall, a storm outside, and a guest list full of men and women who measured worth in reputation. They would be my witnesses. On the morning of the dinner, I stood before the long mahogany table, set for 12. Crystal glasses gleamed under the key chandelier. Candles waited to be lit, their flames eager to flicker against the storm-darkened windows. I imagined the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the moment when polite conversation would dissolve into whispers of scandal. I imagined Thomas's face when he realized the evening was slipping out of his control. But above all, I imagined the silence The moment after the final revelation, when every eye in the room would turn to him, and he would see himself the way I had always seen him, a hollow man built of arrogance and lies. They would come expecting to see me broken. They would leave having witnessed his destruction. As I checked the final place setting, I caught my reflection in the polished silver platter at the center of the table. For the first time in months, I did not see a victim. I saw a woman sharpening her own weapon, and I whispered so softly the words seemed to belong to the storm outside. Let the games begin. The storm arrived early. By late afternoon, the sky had already turned a heavy shade of iron, pressing down on the estate with the weight of inevitability. I stood at the upstairs window, watching the first sheets of rain slash across the manicured gardens, their symmetry blurred into chaos. Nature itself seemed eager to conspire with me. Inside, the house glowed. Every chandelier was lit, every candle readied, as if defying the storm's attempt to smother us in darkness. I had chosen the table's design carefully. Deep crimson, roses in tall crystal vases, their petals blood-dark against the white linen, silver cutlery polished until each fork looked sharp enough to wound. There would be no warmth tonight, no comfort. Even the beauty would cut. By 6 o'clock, the first guests arrived. The storm forced them in quickly, their coats damp, their faces flushed from the cold. I greeted them with the serene smile of a hostess who had nothing to hide. My hands were steady, my voice gracious. No one would see the sharpened blade beneath the velvet. Richard, Margaret, I said, leaning in to kiss their cheeks. Richard Hale was Thomas's longest business partner, a man with the tired dignity of someone who had sold more of himself than he cared to admit. Margaret, sharp-eyed and elegant, squeezed my hand a moment too long. Her glance flickered to me, with something unspoken, pity perhaps, or curiosity. Dr. Alan Pierce and his wife Caroline followed. Alan had the nervous smile of a man who was always calculating, even in pleasantries. Caroline's warmth was genuine. She held me longer than necessary, whispering, "You look radiant, Sophia." It was a kindness I hadn't expected, and for a fleeting moment, I felt the sting of tears. I buried it beneath another smile. By the time Daniel Wright arrived, young, ambitious, eager to please, the storm was in full force. Thunder rattled. The windows and the wind clawed at the shutters like an animal desperate to get in. The butler confirmed what I had already suspected. The roads were closing. No one would be leaving early tonight. And then, as if the evening had been waiting for its true opening act, Thomas appeared. He stepped into the dining hall like a king into his court, his expensive suit tailored to perfection, his smile wide and hollow. On his arm was Vanessa. She was radiant in a sapphire gown, the color chosen carefully to contrast the blood-red roses on the table. Her hair was pulled into waves that caught the light, her laughter just a fraction too loud. She clung to Thomas's arm as though she feared disappearing without his touch. I greeted her with warmth so perfect it was almost cruel. "Vanessa," I said, kissing her cheek. "You look lovely." Her eyes searched mine, waiting for the bitterness, the crack in my composure. She found none. Only poise, that unsettled, her more than any insult could. We gathered in the grand parlor first, as tradition demanded. Glasses of champagne were passed, conversation rose and fell, and the storm howled against the tall windows like a jealous spectator. Thomas thrived. Under the attention, drawing his guests close with anecdotes and false modesty, he introduced Vanessa with a flourish, as though daring anyone to object. "She's been such a comfort," he said, the words designed to pierce me in front of them all. The room tittered with polite laughter. My smile never wavered. Instead, I leaned into the role he had written for me. The gracious, heartbroken wife, too refined to protest, too well-bred to crumble. I laughed when expected, nodded when spoken to, my hand steady around my champagne glass. Every second of composure was a needle beneath his skin. He wanted me broken. Instead, I was flawless. Dinner was announced. We moved into the dining hall, where the long table awaited like an executioner's block. Candles flickered, throwing shadows that danced across the polished silver. Outside, the storm screamed against the walls, but inside, the stage was set. Thomas took his seat at the head of the table. Vanessa placed herself beside him, radiant, smug. I sat opposite, where I could see them both. The guests filled in the spaces between, their chatter filling the air with a nervous warmth. They thought this would be another of Thomas's glittering soirees, another evening of indulgence. But as I smoothed my napkin across my lap, I felt the calm certainty of a woman who had already decided how the night would end. This was not his kingdom anymore. This was my theater, and the performance was about to begin. The first course arrived in silence, silver domes lifted to reveal delicate plates of seared scallops and fennel. The storm outside cracked against the windows, thunder rolling like a drum roll for the night ahead. I raised my glass. "A toast," I said, my voice calm, clear. Every head turned toward me. Thomas glanced at me with faint irritation, as if expecting a sentimental, embarrassing plea. He loved to imagine me fragile in front of others. Instead, I smiled, letting my eyes sweep the room. To old friends and new beginnings, to the future, may it be built on honesty, trust, and solid foundations. The words hung in the air, like smoke. Richard Hale's eyes flickered toward Thomas, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Alan shifted in his chair. Vanessa, oblivious, giggled softly. Thomas's smile thinned, but he lifted his glass anyway. "To honesty," he said. His tone strained. The glasses clinked. I watched Thomas swallow his wine, the first bead of sweat forming at his temple. He knew what I meant, though no one else could accuse me of saying anything at all. That was the beauty of it. The conversation resumed, light and trivial at first. Politics, the storm, an art exhibit in the city. I contributed just enough to seem engaged, my eyes warm, my laughter soft. But I had been waiting for the next moment, one I had carefully prepared. As the servants cleared the scallops and replaced them with roasted duck, the large television mounted above the mantel flickered. At first, it looked like interference. From the storm. Static. Then, suddenly, an email filled the screen. It was Thomas's email. One I had pulled from his computer weeks ago, quietly copied and tucked away. Subject, RE, projected numbers. Body. We'll push the figures. They'll never notice the shortfall. If the investors ask questions, we'll blame the supply chain. The room fell silent. Forks paused mid-air. Richard Hale's eyes narrowed. Alan choked on a sip of wine. "Ah, these storms," I said lightly, tilting my head toward the screen. "Always wreaking havoc on the Wi-Fi." Thomas's face flushed a deep crimson. He leapt to his feet. "Turn that off," he barked at the butler. The poor man scrambled with the remote, fumbling until the screen went black again. The silence stretched. Richard cleared his throat, his voice carefully neutral. "Interesting numbers there, Thomas." Thomas forced a laugh, but it rang false. Out of context. Completely out of context. Old drafts. Nothing more. "Of course," I said gently, laying my hand on the table as if soothing a child. "We all know you'd never mislead your partners." The words dripped with sweetness, but the edge beneath them sliced cleanly. Thomas stared at me across the table, fury burning in his eyes. He couldn't accuse me without sounding paranoid. He couldn't accuse the storm. He was trapped. The conversation limped forward after that, forced and brittle. Guests exchanged polite words, but their laughter was tight, their eyes sharp. The storm outside pounded harder, as though applauding the first fracture in Thomas's facade. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my wine. I could feel the balance, shifting already. For the first time in years, Thomas was not untouchable. He was vulnerable, and everyone in that room had seen it, and I had only just begun. By the third course, the room had changed. The storm outside raged louder, its winds rattling the windows like a warning, but it was nothing compared to the storm I'd summoned within these walls. The guests were restless now. Their laughter had gone brittle, their eyes sharp, measuring each word, each glance. Richard's hand lingered on his wine glass, his knuckles pale. Margaret, ever perceptive, watched Thomas like a hawk circling over wounded prey. Thomas tried to recover, tried to spin conversation back to safer waters. He launched into an anecdote about his latest hotel expansion, his voice artificially loud. But the guests listened with polite detachment. The crack from earlier still echoed in the room. I waited until the plates were cleared and dessert prepared before I struck again. The butler returned with coats that had been moved earlier to the cloakroom for drying. He held Vanessa's sapphire shawl draped elegantly over his arm, but as he offered it to her, something glittered and fell from the folds onto the polished floor. A diamond bracelet. Not just any bracelet. Margaret Hale's. The room froze. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her bare wrist. "My bracelet," she whispered. I thought I left it at home." The butler bent quickly, picking it up. "It was found in Ms. Cole's pocket," he said innocently, holding it out. Vanessa's face drained of color. "No," she sputtered. "That's not mine. I don't know how that got there." Margaret's sharp gaze cut into her, suspicion gleaming. "Strange," she said softly. Vanessa turned frantically to Thomas. "You know I would never." Thomas rose, his face a storm of his own. "This is ridiculous. Clearly a mistake. Margaret, you must have dropped it." "And it into her coat pocket?" Richard's voice was icy. "Quite the accident." Vanessa's hands shook as she tried to return the bracelet, her eyes darting to me. She was searching for sympathy, for solidarity. I gave her none. Instead, I laid my hand gently over Margaret's wrist. "How fortunate it was found so quickly," I said smoothly. "These storms make it far too easy for little things to be misplaced." Margaret nodded, her suspicion momentarily soothed, though her lips remained pressed in a thin line. Vanessa sat stiff in her chair, her shoulders tight, her perfect composure unraveling thread by thread. The mistress who had paraded into my home, like a queen, now looked like a thief at a tribunal. Thomas's fury radiated across the table, but he was trapped. He couldn't defend Vanessa without appearing biased. He couldn't accuse me without evidence. Every move he made only tightened the snare. I let the silence stretch until it felt unbearable, then smiled softly. "Shall we continue?" The dessert was served. Delicate chocolate soufflés dusted with powdered sugar. Steam curled from them, fragile and fleeting. A perfect metaphor for Thomas's crumbling facade. Conversation picked up again, though slower now, cautious. Guests exchanged wary glances. The room was heavy with suspicion and unease. Vanessa barely touched her plate. That was when the final slip of the evening's course appeared. A servant, carrying a silver tray of coffee, placed an envelope beside. "Richard Hale. Delivered earlier, sir," the butler explained. Richard frowned, opening it. His eyes scanned the page, then darkened. He looked up sharply at Thomas. "Is this true?" he demanded. The table stiffened. Thomas's face went pale. What are you talking about?" Richard read aloud, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Projected quarterly losses disguised as gains. Funds redirected. Investors deliberately misled." All eyes turned to Thomas. "That's confidential." Thomas exploded, his face red, his voice cracking. Richard slammed the paper down. Confidential because it's criminal. The silence that followed was heavier than the thunder outside. Vanessa stared at him, horrified. Alan's hand shook as he reached for his coffee. Caroline looked away, ashamed. I sipped my wine, calm and unshaken. Each revelation was carefully timed, each thread pulled tighter. Thomas's empire wasn't crumbling tomorrow or next week. It was crumbling now, in real time, before the people whose opinion he valued most. And he knew it. His eyes found mine across the table. They blazed with hatred, desperation, and dawning fear. For the first time in our marriage, Thomas Turner looked at me not as his wife, not as his victim, but as his enemy. The room had gone cold despite the roaring fire in the hearth. The storm outside hammered the windows, lightning flashing white across the walls, as though nature itself wanted to illuminate every dark corner of Thomas's lies. He sat rigid at the head of the table, his face red, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. The paper Richard had read aloud lay abandoned near his untouched dessert, damning evidence spread open for all to see. I won't sit here and be slandered in my own home, Thomas snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. His hand trembled as he reached for his wine. These are accidents, mistakes. None of this means anything. Richard leaned forward, his gaze cold. Accidents don't forge documents, Thomas. Accidents don't falsify numbers. Vanessa shifted beside him, her hand brushing his arm. Maybe we should leave, she whispered, her eyes darting nervously around the table. Leave? Margaret's laugh was short, humorless. In this storm? You're trapped here, same as the rest of us. Vanessa paled. She shrank back in her chair as whispers swirled like smoke around her. Once the glittering mistress, she now looked small, desperate and terrified. Thomas slammed his fist against the table, the crystal glasses rattling, wine sloshing onto the linen. Enough, he bellowed. This is all her doing. Every eye in the room turned to me. My heart pounded, but my expression remained serene. I dabbed the corner of my lips with my napkin and looked at him calmly. Her doing? I asked softly. You, he hissed. Don't play innocent, Sophia. You've orchestrated this entire charade. The toast, the email, the bracelet, the documents. It's all you. You've been waiting to humiliate me. I tilted my head, as though puzzled by his outburst. Thomas, I said gently, surely you don't expect our friends to believe I planted your emails, forged your signatures, or misplaced Margaret's jewelry. That sounds paranoid. Gasps and murmurs rippled around the table. Richard's brow furrowed. Alan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Caroline's eyes flicked to me, wide with surprise but tinged with something else. Admiration. Thomas rose to his feet, towering, his fists clenched at his sides. Don't look at me like I'm insane, he shouted. She's manipulating. All of you! Can't you see it? Lightning split the sky outside, illuminating his face twisted in rage. The perfect businessman, the charming host, reduced to a furious, desperate man in front of his peers. Thomas, Margaret said coolly, her voice cutting through his tirade. You're making quite the scene. The words sliced deeper than any accusation. He turned on her, his mouth opening to retort, but no words came. His empire had always depended on their respect, their awe. Now he was unraveling in front of them, and they were watching with thinly veiled disgust. Vanessa tugged at his sleeve. Thomas, please, she whispered, her voice trembling. You're only making it worse. He shook her off violently. Shut up, he snarled, the words ricocheting off the high ceilings. The guests recoiled. Margaret gasped. Caroline flinched. In a single moment, Thomas had not only destroyed his reputation as a businessman, but also as a gentleman. I rose slowly, deliberately, smoothing my gown with steady hands. "Please forgive him," I said, my voice soft but carrying across the table. The pressure of his work, the storm. It seems to have unsettled him. That was the final twist of the knife. My calmness made his fury look all the more unhinged. Thomas pointed a shaking finger at me. "This isn't over, Sophia," he growled. I met his gaze, unflinching. "Oh, Thomas," I whispered, just loud enough for the table to hear. "It already is." The silence that followed was suffocating. The storm pounded outside, a relentless drumbeat marking the end of his reign. His allies had become his judges. His mistress had become his liability. And his wife, the woman he thought he could humiliate into submission, was now the one holding every card. I sat back down, folding my hands in my lap. Around me, the guests whispered, their voices low and damning. Thomas Turner, the untouchable, King of Greenwich, had finally begun to fall, and I wasn't finished yet. The storm raged outside, a relentless drumbeat against the glass, as if it too demanded a verdict. Inside, the dining room had descended into a heavy, suffocating silence. The once glittering dinner party had become a tribunal, and Thomas stood, in the center, his empire crumbling around him. His face was flushed, his tie askew, sweat shining under the chandelier's golden light. He looked less like the powerful man who'd ruled this house and more like a cornered animal, snarling at shadows. "Sit down, Thomas," Richard said, his voice cool. "You're only digging deeper." He turned to me, eyes wild. "Tell them, Sophia! Admit what you've done!" I rose slowly, the hush of fabric as my gown swept the floor sounding louder than the storm. My pulse was steady now. The moment I had waited for was here. "Very well," I said softly, lifting my chin. "If the truth is what you want, then the truth is what you'll have." The guests shifted in their seats, leaning forward. The air itself seemed to tighten, every breath held. I crossed to the sideboard where I had placed a simple leather folder. My fingers brushed it lightly before I turned back to face the table. "For years," I began, my voice steady and clear, "Thomas has asked me to play the perfect wife, to smile while he humiliated me, to play hostess while he carried on affairs, to keep silent while he made his fortune in ways that—" I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the men at the table. "Would not survive the light of day." Thomas's eyes widened. "Don't you dare!" "Oh, I dare," I whispered. I opened the folder and began pulling out papers one by one. Emails, bank transfers, shell company records. I had spent months collecting them in secret, piecing together the puzzle of his empire. Every lie, every theft, every betrayal. "These," I said, laying the documents on the table, "are copies of transactions made to offshore accounts in the Caymans. Accounts tied directly to Thomas. These show funds siphoned from projects his partners invested in. These," I held up another page, "are communications with developers paid to cut corners and bury safety violations. And this," I placed the final sheet down with a deliberate hand, "is proof that Thomas Turner embezzled from his own employees' retirement fund." The gasp that went around the table was sharp enough to slice through the storm. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Alan muttered a curse under his breath. Richard's face darkened with fury. "You've ruined us all," Richard hissed. Thomas lunged for the documents, but I slid them away before he could touch them. "These are only copies," I said coolly. "The originals are already in safe. And if anything happens to me, they will be delivered to the authorities." He froze, his breath ragged, his hands shaking. "You wouldn't," he said, his voice barely more than a rasp. I smiled, a cold, sharp thing. "I already did." The chandelier above flickered as the storm roared, the room cast in momentary shadow. When the light steadied, every eye was on Thomas, and not one held sympathy. Vanessa sat stiffly, her face pale, her glittering facade shattered. "You told me you were untouchable," she whispered, her voice hollow. Thomas looked around the room, searching desperately for an ally, but found none. The partners he'd relied on now stared at him with open disgust. The mistress he'd flaunted shrank from his side, and I stood tall, the perfect hostess, at last in control. "Your reign is over, Thomas," I said, my voice carrying through the storm's roar. "Tonight, everyone sees you for what you are. A liar, a thief, a coward." His shoulders sagged, his face collapsed into something pitiful, broken. The man who once looked down on me as fragile, powerless, insignificant, was now ruined, destroyed by the very woman he underestimated. The clock in the hall struck midnight, the chimes echoing like a sentence passed. I turned back to the table, raising my glass once more. "To new beginnings," I said softly. The guests hesitated, then, one by one, lifted their glasses. Not for Thomas, but for me. And with that, my revenge was complete.